Hey up, lads and lasses, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the good old Yorkshire stream. It's me, Bowler Hat Man, coming to you live from the very heart of Yorkshire. And kicking off with us today, obviously, as you know, thank you very much to you all last time for donating. As you can see, this is it. Spartan victory. We will be going over this this drivel in just a moment. But before we do that, let's greet everyone in chat as we always do. So, like I say, as we are just here, please do remember to hit that like and share button. Like I say, it does massively help out the stream, helps keep people more in, and obviously more people in, the more chats we can have right here. So let's kick off then, shall we? Colin Thompson, greetings from New York. Well, good morning. Well, good morning, evening. I don't know, afternoon to you. I can't remember time zones now. Paul Clark, greetings from your living room. Well, hello to your living room, wherever your living room may be. Pretty Bird, good morning from the Pacific Northwest. Carol OG, evening to you. Itchy Back, good evening to you. Hope that we can help reach that itch for you today. Pretty Bird, hope you didn't have to pay full price. No, I've done some, well, unfortunately I did, but it was £9. So, but put it this way, a little tidbit, because as you may know, this apparently, according to Mark Francois, is #1 on Amazon. Well, I worked for a guy back in 2016. I won't say the name of the company, that would be unfair. But I worked for a company and he did the exact same thing. What he used to do, he used to write loads of books about property development, essentially. That was his thing. And he wrote all these books, all these many continuous books. Some of them were exactly the same book, just regurgitated. He also tried to make himself a lifestyle guru. I don't know if he's still doing that at the same time. But again, pretty much most of what he was saying in his book was pretty much just taken from, shall we say, someone else's more popular book, but rephrased to go into his book, essentially. And what he used to do to get his book to be #1 was you used to select your book to appear in a different section. Thus, when people bought your book in, shall we say, a significant number, you would show up as #1 being in that list. And of course, if you don't know, I think it's still the case. If you go on Amazon right now, if you look for Spartan Victory, it's not listed. It is not listed under politics, which is where you would normally find this book. You know, it would either be politics or biography. You will not find it under there. This book, again, just like the person I used to work for, they used to put it in different categories. A lot, shall we say, lower priority categories like publishing, like Mark Francois did. And then what they would do is they would buy a whole load of copies. In fact, I remember sitting in the office one day and this massive lorry literally turning up, and the pallet, all these books were stacked on pallets, and there must have been hundreds of thousands of books that he bought to essentially make his book #1. I also remember the fact that he used to go around bribing us, saying, "Here, I'll give you 20 quid if you buy the book and then write a review on Amazon." So if anyone from Amazon ever wants to, shall we say, know who that is, I'll happily let you know. But anyway, yes, don't worry, we will be diving into Spartan Victory in a bit. But like I say, the first like couple of chapters, where we're going to be starting this evening? We're going to be starting with chapter 8, with the vote leave and obviously the 2016 EU referendum, because that, quite frankly, is where the good stuff, shall we say, starts to happening. Before that, it's pretty much Mark Francois' journey in the Conservative Party, how he became an MP. The fact that, again, he lost to John Bercow at a debating club, and especially later on in the book, makes a point of how he feels he bested Bercow later on. Again, he wasn't really a debate club. But again, I haven't seen, shall we say, Mark Francois challenge Bercow to a debate since then. Bizarre as that may be. But before we do go diving, shall we say, headfirst into the pages of Spartan Victory and its colouring book-esque nonsense, we're going to go over the North Shropshire by-election. That is happening tomorrow. We will obviously get the results Thursday, late Thursday night, probably early Friday morning. We'll have to see. But this election is on a knife edge. Polling has just come in literally like the last 30 minutes of me starting the stream, that the Tories and the Lib Dems are literally almost neck and neck. The Tories are polling at 40%. The Lib Dems are at 39%. This election could be decided on an absolute knife edge. And I don't have to tell you what the political fallout will be if Boris Johnson loses this seat to the Lib Dems. It will be huge. It will send seismic waves through the Conservative Party, and it will not be a very, very happy Christmas for Boris. But let's say Boris and the Conservatives narrowly managed to hang on. And I'm talking narrowly managed to hang on, literally by a finger. It's still not going to be a very happy Christmas, because a lot of those Conservative MPs that did a lot of rebelling yesterday, almost 100 of them decided to rebel yesterday over the new regulations that were put forward in the Commons. They will not be a very happy bunny at all. And neither will the rest, quite frankly, of the Conservative Party. So if you are out in North Shropshire and you vote, please do vote for the Lib Dems. I know I'm a card-carrying member of the Labour Party here, but in this case, the Lib Dems are probably more poised to win in that area better than the Labour Party is. So in this area, if you are out in North Shropshire, if you are a Labour voter, if you are a Green voter, if you are an independent voter, tomorrow, please go and vote Lib Dems, especially if you want to give Boris Johnson a punch in the nose. He quite frankly deserves it, to be honest. But there we go. That's essentially how you can essentially make Boris's Christmas, by voting for the Lib Dems tomorrow in that by-election. If you happen to be in that area, if you know anyone who happens to be in that area, please do encourage them to go out and go to the polls, and again, get them to vote Lib Dem if you can. So, with that said, we're just going to go dive quickly into this article, because I think this is just exemplifying how close North Shropshire really is in this. So this comes from Politics Home, and the title is "Just a Few Hundred Votes Could Decide the Tories' Fate in North Shropshire." The Conservative and Liberal Democrat activists campaigning in North Shropshire believe that there could just be a few hundred votes between the two parties in this Thursday's by-election. Boris Johnson is clinging onto the seat, where the Tories have a 23,000 majority after a by-election was triggered by the resignation of the ex-Conservative MP Owen Paterson over his role in the lobbying scandal. The rural seat in the West Midlands has always voted Conservative, but after a very tumultuous few weeks in Downing Street, where Johnson has angered his own Conservative MPs over allegations of lying to the Electoral Commission and reports of Christmas parties at Number 10 during the late 2020 lockdown, the vote is being viewed by many as a referendum on Johnson's credibility as a leader. One senior Conservative MP said the reaction from backbench MPs would be volcanic if the party lost the seat. Multiple opinion polls have already shown significant drops in support for both Johnson and the Conservatives. Figures in the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, who Politics Home met on the campaign trail this week, believe the results literally are on a knife edge. Liberal Democrats hope that enough Labour and Green voters will lend them their support to defeat the Tory candidate. There has been a lot of things over the past 2 years that people have dismissed as Westminster bubble stories, but this isn't. The former Liberal Democrat leader and MP for Westmoreland Lonsdale, Tim Farron, told Politics Home on Monday. Farron has been campaigning the constituency for the Lib Dem candidate Helen Morgan, a local parish councillor who also runs a business in the region. He said the recent controversies involving the Prime Minister had come up very frequently on the doorstep. This is a patch like mine, where the average age of the electorate is a bit older than the national average. There's a very high number of here who have spent Christmas alone or saw grandma through the window of the nursing home, he continued. It's one rule for us, another for them, alongside the general sense of being taken for granted is really very powerful. With over 5,643 votes in the 2019 general election, the Lib Dems were the third biggest party in the constituency behind Labour, who took over 12,000 votes. Farron stressed that the victory for his party would only be possible if the constituents who usually support the Labour and the Greens vote tactically for Morgan. The Tories will hold this seat if Labour and the Greens vote Labour and Green, he said. But if they generally lend us their vote, like the gentleman and like this gentleman, the family are doing, then we can nick this, and it will be very famous victory if it happens. Indeed, it will be. Oof. Like I say, Christ, if this happens, like, I cannot tell you, like, the reaction will be from Tory MPs if this happens. Like, if this actually happens, I will immediately get up and do a live stream, because there is no way there isn't a significant reaction from the Conservatives if this goes to the Lib Dems. If this goes to the Lib Dems, it's over. It's over for Boris. Completely, well and truly over for him. So yeah, I think you get the idea, to be honest. I think you get the idea that this is going to be on a knife edge, this election. But like I say, if you are in the area or you know someone in the area and they are registered to vote in that area, then please, please, please do get them out to vote. It does look like every vote is going to count on here. Let me just set up. Yes. There we go. Just what you need for a good book reading. Just what you need for a good book reading. A good fire, nice warm fire. So warm your hands by the fire, ladies and gentlemen, because it is time. Like I said last week, I said if you would fund it, I would buy it, and you funded it, so I bought it. Spartan Victory: The Inside Story of the Battle for Brexit by the Right Honourable Mark Francois MP. Of course, with the infamous quote from Jacob Rees-Mogg: "If you voted for Brexit, you really ought to buy this book." So let's crack on with this then, shall we? So, hang on, where's chapter 8? Chapter 8, there we are. 163. Here we are. I hope you're sitting comfortably. I hope you're sitting comfortably, for we shall begin this reading of the Spartan Victory. Chapter 8, Vote Leave and the 2016 EU referendum. The issue of Europe is one that has divided the Conservative Party for almost 5 decades. As a party, we've been arguing over it even before Ted Heath took us into the European Economic Community in 1973. As Jacob Rees-Mogg has reminded me on several occasions, even the vote to join the EEC led to a split in the Tory ranks of those who already had doubts about surrendering sovereignty. Voting against it at the time, the Labour Party were also officially opposed to joining the ECC, but a number of pro-European Labour MPs, such as Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams, some of whom will be later break away from Labour and form the Social Democratic Party, or the SDP, in the 1980s, defied the Labour whip and helped Heath carry his motion to join the ECC over the party line with just 8 votes back in 1972. So, again, something he has about this. It's not so much votes, it's almost as if this was written in like short sprints and different sections, because that's chapter 8 up there. No, hang on, it's disappearing into the void. Chapter 8, I don't know if you can see it up here. Chapter 8 starts there. There's the first paragraph. Then you get another header. There's then another couple of texts before we get another header. So this wasn't typically written like a normal book would. It's more been written almost as, this is the particular thought I've had. This is what chapter it should belong to. It's very strangely written like that. So, still part of chapter 8. The evolution of the Conservative European policy from Health to Cameron. So, when the UK subsequently joined the ECC in January of 1973, the makeup of the Conservative Parliamentary Party was overwhelmingly pro-European in nature. In many ways, this was very understandable. The House of Commons in the early 1970s was still contained a considerable number of MPs who had fought in the Second World War, Ted Heath included. But many of them saw the ECC as a further European integration as a way of preventing such major conflagration ever breaking out again on the European continent. Being pro-European was therefore very much of the orthodoxy of the time, so much so that in the 1975 referendum on whether the UK should remain within the European Economic Community, even Margaret Thatcher campaigned for a vote yes, i.e. to stay in, with a famously photographed colourful jumper emblazoned by a number of European national flags as part of the Yes campaign. However, once in Downing Street, Margaret Thatcher became increasingly concerned over the growing power of the European institutions and what she saw as the continuing attempt to impinge upon the everyday life of ordinary Britons, via policies such as the Common Agricultural Policy, which she helped negotiate. He doesn't mention this for some reason. She helped negotiate the Common Agricultural Policy, and she negotiated the rebate that UK farmers got from that. That was considered a win. That was considered a win for Margaret Thatcher. So where were we? The Common Agricultural Policy, the Common Fisheries Policy, and even the administration of the value-added tax of VAT. In 1988, Mrs. Thatcher gave her famous Bruges speech, in which she warned that we in Britain have not worked so hard in order to roll back the front lines of the state, only to see them reimposed upon us at a European level. Again, this was very strange speech, because Margaret Thatcher, again, an entire ethos was about building the customs union and single market. She was integral to the creation of that. But obviously, Margaret Thatcher, being very much an 80s conservative, was very, very much about getting rid of regulations as she saw it. And she was far more worried that Europe was going to bring in many of these regulations back. And almost from Labour came the opposite end. Labour were worried that at that time, the ECC was very much a capitalist trap that we were going to fall into. That was the Lexit mindset. So anyway, there were very bitter arguments over Europe, combined with the unpopularity of the community charge, rapidly dubbed the poll tax, that eventually led to Margaret Thatcher's departure from office in 1990. She had fallen out of the ardently pro-European Michael Heseltine over the future ownership of the Westland Helicopter Company when he famously stormed out of the cabinet in 1986. She then fell out of other pro-European members of the cabinet, including her very own Deputy Prime Minister Sir Godfrey Ho, as well as fighting running battles with former Chancellor Nigel Lawson about Britain's membership of the exchange rate mechanism. And every bit in her fall of the 1990, with the bulk of the Conservative backbenchers, were more increasingly pro-European than Eurosceptic. Margaret Thatcher's successor, of course, was John Major, then famously centred to the Maastricht Treaty, which led to the European Economic Community evolving into the new entity, the European Union, which increasingly proposed the trappings of a state. Perhaps most controversially, of course, the Maastricht Treaty pledged the creation of a single European currency, later to become known as the euro. And of course, Major's government rapidly deepened and divided over whether or not to eventually abandon the pound sterling and just join the European single currency instead. Once significantly summed up by the John Major as just wait and see, during the bitter battles over the Maastricht Treaty in Parliament, Major also faced a minority of Eurosceptic cabinet colleagues, including John Wedgwood, Michael Portillo, and of course several others, who were often recorded in the moments at the end of an interview. He famously described them as, the bastards. By 1995, such was the division in the Conservative Party over the European issue that Major directly challenged his critics to put up or shut up. This led to a leadership election against John Wedgwood, who coined the slogan, "No change, no chance." But with Major comfortably won by 280 votes to 89. However, significantly at that stage, the only Conservative MPs who were allowed to vote on the leader, and it was not until the 2021 leadership contest that ordinary Conservative Party members were finally given the say. Major's divided and exhausted government was nevertheless overwhelmingly defeated by Tony Blair's incoming new Labour administration back in 1997. Pretty much as Wedgwood had predicted 2 years earlier. As the new Prime Minister, Blair then came under strong pressure from his European neighbours to commit the Labour government to joining the euro. However, he too had cabinet opponents on this idea, led by his powerful Chancellor at the time, Gordon Brown, strongly surrounded by allies such as Special Advisor Ed Balls and the influential press aide Dallin McBride. Conservative Party under William Hague, still reeling from its crushing electoral defeat, nevertheless put up a strong pressure on Blair not to join the euro. And it was officially launched on the 1st of January 1999 amidst considerable pomp and ceremony, accompanied by the EU anthem Ode to Joy. The combination of internal Labour opposition and external Conservative and media pressure successfully managed to dissuade Blair, who was inclined to joining the single currency, at the risk of certainly not to do so without a referendum. Although the Conservative Party was heavily again defeated in the 2001 general election under William Hague, his Keep the Pound campaign was the centrepiece of the Tories' 2001 election pitch. Again, it succeeded in helping to deter Blair from chancing it. As William said several years later at a conference at the Royal United Services Institute, which I attended, he said, "We campaigned to keep the pound. And indeed, we've kept the pound. So at least we won that one, if nothing else." But at this stage, the Conservative Party is still politically... the Conservative Party's policy on the single currency had become the touchstones of the party's wider policy on the Europe as a whole. Under William Hague, the compromise with his influential, very pro-European shadow councillor Kenneth Clarke, it was agreed that the party's policy would not be to join the single currency for at least a parliament. William Hague's successor as Tory leader, Ian Duncan Smith, hardened this policy to the opposition of joining the currency as a matter of principle. a position which was pretty much maintained in turn by his successor, Michael Howard. By the time David Cameron took over as leader in 2005, the Conservatives still remained in opposition in principle to joining the currency, with David Cameron's additional comment that he would withdraw his MEPs from the pro-federalist European People's Party, or the EEP, in the European Parliament, something which we have successfully achieved with me as a project manager back in 2009. And let's not miss that point there. Part of the reason, obviously, Cameron did this was to try and leverage some negotiating position over the EU. And instead, what he ended up doing, this new grouping of MPs that, again, he created, basically became known as the Wacko Group of the European Parliament. And it still is known as the Wacko Group now. All the very, very anti-EU parties, the very right wing of the parties, are all in there. So they're all there. So they're there, essentially. So the next part is called "We Shall Not Let Matters Rest There." So this is where it starts becoming interesting now. You're probably going to start to see the ERG come into play now. So shortly after becoming the Conservative leader, David Cameron, whose greatest ally was his shadow chancellor George Osborne, invited William Hague to come out of retirement and become his shadow foreign secretary. William agreed and then led the opposition to yet another European centralizing treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, with me acting as his deputy as the shadow minister of Europe. We had campaigned hard to try and persuade Gordon Brown to hold a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, but he absolutely refused, knowing that he had sufficient votes in the House of Commons to ram the treaty through with a very large majority, larger than Major's had ever enjoyed over the Maastricht some 16 years previously. However, David Cameron, in an article in The Sun, famously offered a, quote, cast iron guarantee that an oncoming Conservative government would hold a national referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, providing that it had not that it had been ratified at the time that we came into power. Unfortunately, most commentators and members of the public only heard this first bit of the sentence and not the second bit. Therefore, there was a great disappointment when the treaty was eventually ratified and Cameron announced that, unfortunately, a referendum would no longer be possible as the treaty was now officially binding in international law. Oh, pardon me. Nevertheless, during subsequent debates in Parliament, then launched by the Labour Party, on what the Conservatives would do, William Hague shot back that if we came into power and the treaty had already been then ratified, then we would not let matters rest there. He said this during a debate on the foreign affairs portion of the Queen's speech back in November 6, 2007. And at the time, most commentators missed it, except for the BBC's then political editor, Nick Robinson, who remembered it immediately that William said he had said something really significant. When I spoke to Williams afterwards, I had asked what exactly he had meant by it, to which he replied that it just hadn't worked out for the detailed policy. He was just determined that if they did manage to ram the treaty through without a referendum, that they won't get away with it, Mark, and that we would have to respond in some other way. And we therefore spent several months and numerous meetings trying to work out exactly what our response would actually mean. We shall not let matters rest here, or WSNLMRT. I spent much time with William and his special advisor, Daniel Davidson, and my own researcher, Chris Howard, checking over options for what we could do to riposte and what might actually be. After an endless internal debate, I took Denzel and Chris out for a night at the pub just off the Shropshire Square. One evening at an upstairs bar, I told them, right, we're not leaving this pub until we have an actual plan to put to William on Monday. Is this... I get the feeling here that Mark Francois is going to try and claim, like, credit, like, completely for Brexit. I get that feeling that this is where this book's going. Certainly feels like it. In the end, of course, on the 23rd of January 2008, David Cameron finally unveiled the basis of what "we shall not let matters remain here rest" actually meant. The centerpiece of this was the referendum lock. Not to have a referendum on the Lisbon, but to ensure that if any subsequent European treaty were to be negotiated, which transferred further powers from Westminster to Brussels, this could not be ratified unless first endorsed by the British people in a referendum. There were several other aspects to "we shall not let matters rest here," but the referendum lock was undoubtedly the central element, and it became the centerpiece of our European policy on the subsequent 2010 general election. The resultant coalition government, which was a very, again, highly pro-European Liberal Democrats, meant that David Cameron was keen to very much downplay the European issue. It was not politically very diverse within the partnership, and in the end, all the crunch policy decisions were taken by four men: David Cameron, George Osborne, and Nick Clegg, and his right-hand man, Danny Alexandra, Chief Secretary for the Treasury under George, in what has become known across Whitehall as the Quad. Given the processing economic crisis with the coalition government that had inherited from Gordon Brown, the last thing the Quad wanted to do was to spend hours endlessly debating the European policy. Again, notice that they're again talking about the 2008 financial crash as just something that they inherited from Gordon Brown. No, go back to what the 2008 financial crash was. It was all to do with the US housing market, which had a massive ripple effect across the world. And yes, the UK did get caught up in that, as did many other countries. And it was, again, very, very much, well, the Conservatives who drove home hard the agenda of austerity. And as the Lib Dems even said continuously, while we are in favour of some austerity, we are not in favour of to the extent that the Conservatives want to go. And if you remember the next general election, they were campaigning again that there should be yet another coalition government and that you should vote for the Lib Dems because we will keep the Conservatives sweet and nice. Whatever that means, but you know. So, however, in the 2010 general election, in which the Conservative Party had made numerous gains, we saw into play in the Parliament a considerable number of far more Eurosceptic Conservative MPs, such as Steve Barker, Conor Burns, Zach Goldsmith, Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, and one Jacob Rees-Mogg, among others. And so the pressure from the Conservative backbenchers on David Cameron to do something muscular about Europe only intensified. Rather than wanted, indeed, in 2012, 73 Conservative MPs voted for an amendment calling for a referendum on British membership of the European Union. Although the amendment itself was very poorly drafted and talked about a referendum with 3 questions on it rather than a straight in and out choice, which is one of the reasons why it did not gain further support. I thought personally that the 3-question referendum was particularly unworkable, and so I didn't vote for it either. However, this action gave notice that despite Cameron's famous dictum that the Conservative Party should stop banging on about Europe, the issue still aroused strong passions from many Tory MPs, and this was not clearly going to go away. So, why was a 3? If I ever could question Mark Francois, I would love to know why a 3-question referendum was, quote, unworkable. A 3-quote referendum would have been perfect because you had remain in the European Union, stay as we are, stay in the single market and customs union, or you can leave completely. Like, that would have been it. And I tell you now, it would have been either remain or stay in the single market and customs union. That would have probably have won. Because remember, at the referendum, when it was this in or out question, the Leave campaign specifically ran on the grounds of that we are going to remain in the single market and customs union to try and pull those people over who might not like the EU politically but enjoy the economic benefits of being in the EU. Again, something to always bear in mind. So, here we go now. The rise of UKIP. The United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP, was founded originally as the Anti-Federalist League, a minor Eurosceptic party established in London by the historian Alan Scaled back in 1991. It changed its name to UKIP in 1993, but as a Eurosceptic movement, it was often overshadowed in the mid-1990s by the rival Referendum Party, which had been organised by financier Sir James Goldsmith, rather than father, of course, of the future Tory MP Zac Goldsmith, which stood for a number of candidates against John Major's Conservatives back in the 1997 general election. Jimmy Goldsmith himself stood as one of Major's greatest allies, David Mellor in Putney, in that year, and also arguably took a very significant right-wing votes into contribute to Mellor's defeat. However, the Referendum Party was subsequently dissolved sometime after the 1997 general election, and UKIP effectively took up the mantle of an outwardly Eurosceptic party, and one committed to leave the European Union. In essence, the name was in the clue. In essence, the clue was in the name. That was me there. In 1999, the European elections, UKIP won 3 seats with a 6.5% of the national vote. However, the real driving force behind UKIP as a national entity was Nigel Farage, a city dealer from Kent who was one of the party's wannabe MEPs, who was first elected to the European Parliament in 1999, but then who became UKIP's leader in 2006. This is quite interesting because here you get what Mark Francois actually thinks of UKIP and Nigel Farage. So Farage had a great knack for publicity and for saying what others were thinking but dare not say. Interesting. That's a very interesting quote, Mark. Saying what others were thinking but dare not say. Considering what Nigel has said in the past, do you think the same? But you're too cowardly to say it? That's quite an interesting comment there, Mark. He was also unabashed about talking on about the British establishment and their fellow travellers in the media, who did not shy away from giving often controversial interviews about the growing power of the European Union and the risks of a large-scale immigration into the United Kingdom. The ascension of the so-called A8, or the Eastern European nations to the EU in 2004, did indeed the presage, that's this book desperately needs an editor, of over 1 million Eastern Europeans coming to the UK in a relatively few years, and Farage proved very adept at highlighting the pressures on the national infrastructure and public services that were caused by this spike in immigration. Oh, this is fun, because I was going to say, hold on, Mark. Though numbers have shown that those were actually very economically prosperous. And there's a little part in quotations where he says this, albeit that many of those incoming immigrants actually worked extremely hard and no doubt did contribute to growth of the British economy following their arrival. Okay, well, that's an interesting admission there by Mark. Nevertheless, of course, in 2004, the European elections of UKIP won around 12 seats. Following, of course, the subsequent post-Lisbon Treaty success in the 2009, the European elections, where they won over at least 2 million votes and secured 13 MEPs, UKIP gradually started to stand candidates in local elections, as well as in a number of cases actually managed to get many UKIP councillors elected. And more worryingly, from a Conservative point of view, they very often challenge the Conservative Party directly for the allegiance of right-wing voters. Again, what we've been saying all along, that they are constantly worried from being outflanked by the right. And of course, in the 2010 general election, some defeated Conservative candidates argued that UKIP candidates had almost certainly cost them their seats. David Cameron once famously described UKIP as a bunch of, quote, fruitcakes and loonies and closet racists mostly, which led to a furious reaction from Nigel Farage and indeed from some elements of the right of the Conservative Party, who felt that insulting UKIP and its supporters many of them who were former Conservatives, was not the best way to deal with an electoral challenge that they posed. As the coalition government began to run into trouble on a variety of fronts, pressure grew on David Cameron as the Prime Minister to offer an in-out referendum on membership of the European Union. In order to address the electoral threat from UKIP and also try to settle the increasingly vexing question once and for all. So, Cameron's Bloomingburg speech. After much internal debate among the inner circles in Downing Street in January of 2013, Cameron made the very audacious move in the speech at Bloomberg. He effectively committed to the future majority of the Conservative government holding an in-out referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. The key passage of Cameron's speech went like this. It is time for the British people to have their say. It is time to settle this European question in British politics. And I say to the British people, this will be your decision. And when the choice comes, you will have an important choice to make about our country's destiny. I understand the appeal of going it alone, of charting our own course, but it will be a decision that we will have to take with very cool heads. Proponents of both sides of the argument will need to avoid exaggerating their claims. Something you might want to remind your own side there, Mark. Of course, Britain could make her own way in the world outside the EU if we choose to do so. So could any other member state. But the question we have to ask ourselves, is this the very best future for our country? We will have to weigh very carefully what our true national interest lies. It was difficult in some ways for Liberal Democrats to object to this. Ironically, during the debate on the Lisbon Treaty some 5 years previously, they had argued themselves for an in-out referendum, albeit purely as a device to try and avoid committing to a referendum on Lisbon at the time. Therefore, to some extent, even despair, their disquiet within the coalition at this development, they were effectively hoisted by their own petard. Much has already been written about what finally persuaded David Cameron to make his very fateful decision. At this time, I was serving as the Ministry of Defence, so I effectively had no input in the matter in one way or the other. So in many ways, I was just as surprised as anybody else. And there has since been a rather polemic debate into what led Cameron to make this move. Some would argue that it was solely the external pressure from UKIP, led to by the very proactive Nigel Farage, that then persuaded the Cameron that if UKIP were not to spoil any more chances of winning a subsequent general election outright, he would promise this referendum in order to try and neutralise UKIP threat once and for all. Conversely, though, others in the Conservative Party might argue that it conceded internal pressure from backbench MPs such as Bill Cash, Peter Bone, Phil Davis, and others, who had finally persuaded Cameron that the only way out of this European dilemma was to offer a very distinct plebiscite. Plebiscite. Yeah, strange word. My own view on this, of course, both sides were right. And it was, in fact, a combination of the two, although the precise percentages were difficult to quantify differently in simple terms. It was both external pressure from UKIP combined with the internal pressure from the Conservative backbenchers, plus a few Eurosceptics within Cameron's own cabinet, echoing the right-wing elements of the media that finally led him to conclude that it would be unable to break out of the coalition and win a general election in his own right unless we were to offer the in-out referendum first. When pressed on how he would vote in any such referendum, Cameron hinted he would vote for Britain to stay in the EU, but stressed he would respect the decision of the people, whichever way it went. In 2014, David Cameron subsequently campaigned very successfully in the referendum on Scottish independence, which, whilst he and his allies delivered a significant blow to Alex Salmond's Scottish Nationalist Party, or the SNP, by winning a vote for Scotland that should remain part of the European kingdom by a margin of 55 to 45. This double-digit victory for what Cameron had campaigned extremely hard no doubt emboldened him and those around him to similarly energetic campaign performance would win in any subsequent in-out referendum on the EU as well. The in-out referendum pledge was thus included in the Conservatives' 2015 general election campaign. So, with the exact promise in the manifesto went like this. For too long, your voice has been ignored on Europe. We will give you the say over whether we should stay in or leave the EU with an in-out referendum by the end of 2017. Therefore, over several decades, the Conservative Party policy on Europe had shifted very significantly in a Eurosceptic direction. It had evolved from one joining the European Economic Committee under Ted Heath, whom many people believed secretly dreamed of a federal Europe but dare not say it at the time, to one of advocating the Maastricht Treaty without a referendum and leaving open the possibility of joining the single currency under John Major, to opposition to joining the single currency for the parliamentary under William Hague, to opposition in principle to joining the single currency in both under Ian Duncan Smith and Michael Howard, and then a referendum bloc, and eventually offering the in-out referendum under David Cameron. If plotted, of course, as a political spectrum, it illustrates how very far the European policy had indeed evolved under the Conservative Party over the past 43 years. Between joining the ECC in 1973 for the referendum on whether to leave or what had become the EU in 2016. So, of course, finally, we get to the in-out referendum is called. To the surprise of many political pundits, David Cameron won the 2015 general election, but with a small workable majority of 12 seats, the first outright Conservative general victory since John Major's 23 years previously. Then, with the momentum of both the Scottish referendum and the general election wins behind him, he took the decision to tackle the European issue head-on. Relatively early on in the Parliament, and according on to the 20th February 2016, David Cameron announced that the in-out referendum would take place on the 23rd of June 2016, to effectively settle the question of Britain's future relations with Europe once and for all, as he told the House of Commons. But with the special status of this settlement gives us, I do believe the time has come to fulfil another vital commitment this government made, that is to hold a referendum. So, Mr. Speaker, I today commenced the process to set out our referendum act to propose the British people decide the future of Europe in an in-out referendum on Tuesday, the 23rd of June, 2016. David Cameron, of course, is a politician who has always worn his heart on his sleeve. Whether he was forcing very reluctant members of his party to accept the validity of gay marriage, or indeed his very... That sounds such a bizarre way to put that. Trying to force his very reluctant members in his party to accept the validity of gay marriage. Oh, how progressive of you, Mark. Or, indeed, his own very active campaigning in the Scottish referendum. He's never been one to shy away from a fight. Whereas in 1975, the EC referendum, Harold Wilson, as Prime Minister, let it be known that he favoured remaining in the ECC, but then effectively took very little further part in the campaign, promising the British people that as PM, he would execute faithfully whatever decision they came to. Cameron, obviously controversially, decided from the outset, but rather than remain above the fray, that he would campaign wholeheartedly for Britain to remain in the European Union. And of course, it was said many times, we've covered this, a lot of people would view the referendum not as to join in out or the EU referendum, but just to give Cameron a kicking, essentially. Reputedly, of course, George Osborne did warn his friend Cameron in the strongest possible terms that he should not have considered an in-out referendum, and that it should one day destroy his premiership. Nevertheless, Cameron was obviously convinced that the combination of his energy and commitment was the weight of the British government's machine, that support of media, the full weight of the British establishment behind him, he could indeed successfully carry the day. With consent of the Electoral Commission, were then detailed to oversee the referendum, it was agreed the question on the proposed ballot paper should be as follows. Should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave? This was a very straightforward question and had the effect of gradually polarising this country into two distinct camps, leave and remain. Next part. The £9 million government booklet. Parliament subsequently passed the EU Referendum Act, back in 2016, to effectively set the rules of engagement under which the forthcoming referendum would take place. This mandate each side would at least have one nominally official candidate with each having an equal budget of up to around £7 million to spend on persuading the British public of the case. Of course, we all know what happened on the Leave side with that number of the budget. I wonder if Mark Francois will mention this. However, before the spending limit kicked in, the government did rush out an A5 14-page colour booklet to every household in the United Kingdom entitled "Why the Government Believes that Remaining in the European Union is the Best Decision for the UK." The printing and delivery of this booklet cost in the region of £9 million, and it could be argued this gave the Remain campaign a significant head start. Either way, the 13-page booklet was indeed titled "A Once-in-a-Generation Decision." It wanted to say this: the referendum on Thursday, the 23rd of June, is your best chance. Should you decide, if you should decide to remain or leave in the European Union, the government believes that it is in the best interest of the UK to remain in the EU. This is indeed the best way to protect jobs, provide security, strengthen the UK's economics, and for every family in this country. It is a clear path for the future, in contrast to the uncertainty of leaving, which again we are experiencing very much. This is your decision, he said. The government will not impede your decision. So, the commitment, obviously, from the government in the booklet was sent to every household across the UK prior to the vote. It could have not have been clearer. The language was concise and unambiguous, and it gave a very direct promise to the voters that the government would not impede the decision of the people. This has been a material consideration in which subsequently happened after the votes had actually been counted. Again, interesting, Mark Francois already trying to change the future. We would have had Brexit a lot earlier if him and the rest of the ERG had voted for Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, which was pretty much a carbon copy, just with the name changed, of Boris Johnson's deal that we got last year. So, taking sides. At first glance, the referendum was hardly a fair fight. Pitched on the side of the Remain, there were four established political parties in Britain: the Conservatives, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, whilst in Scotland, the Scottish Nationalist Party were also very firmly in favour of remaining in the EU. This position was supported by almost entirely the British establishment, from the Confederation of British Industry throughout to the Trade Union Congress, the BBC, Sky, and a number of national newspapers ranging from the Times through to the Guardian, the Independent, and the Mirror. Ranged against this was what became known officially nominated as the Vote Leave campaign, which side had no individual single leader, but had support from a number of very prominent cabinet ministers, plus obviously UKIP and a few national newspaper titles, which included the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, Daily Express, and the Sun. Whilst the Eurosceptics therefore did enjoy some support in the popular press, they were heavily outnumbered in the broadcast media, whose leanings, whatever their official position, were clearly overwhelmingly in favour of Remain. Can someone remind me what happened when the media study was done on the 2016 referendum about how Leave got more airtime? Yeah, please do remind me of that. That I know that exists. We remember going through it on this channel when that happened. So again, missing out that very much so, Mark. As just one example, according to the think tank Calvus, in 10 years leading up to the referendum, the BBC's flagship programme Today on Radio 4, whose output Civitas scrutinised in detail, had just 4% of its airtime on the issue of Europe to European sceptic commentators. The other 96% time, of course, had been given to people who were very pro-relationship with the EU, and a pro-European relationship of over 19-1. I suppose it depends on what they were talking about. It's not just a matter of, oh, you managed to get more airtime. It also comes down to what topic was being discussed. Do you think it's really valuable if you have a Eurosceptic commentator when you're talking about something to do with the EU? Well, all they're going to say is EU bad, which is pretty much what they used to say. We've been through this before about when you cover, pre-2016 European Eurosceptics, that their arguments were Europe bad. So for politicians, of course, this was a very clear binary decision. Although few MPs, such as the future Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindley Hall, went through the campaign without being publicly to declare a position for either leave or remain. The vast bulk of MPs decided that they had to fight publicly for one cause or the other. For ministers, this was something of a challenge, as the normal rules of collective responsibility meant that ministers would be expected to adhere to the government's official line, i.e., campaign and vote for Remain. However, in 1975, Harold Wilson had allowed his ministers to campaign on either side of the ECC referendum without having to resign, and people within the government seized this as a precedent. In particular, of course, Chris Grayling and the Transport Secretary in the Cabinet did other Eurosceptic MPs a massive favour when he went to see Cameron and effectively threatened to resign if the Prime Minister did not guarantee a similar leave for ministers to campaign on whichever side the conscience dictated. David Cameron then subsequently announced that he would obviously prefer ministers to campaign and vote for Remain. He did recognise that they had some long-standing reservations about relationship with the EU, and therefore would consent to allowing ministers to campaign for leave without having to resign. Of course, at this time, I was still a minister at the Department for Communities and Local Government, and therefore I too had to decide on which side of the battlefield I would plant my flag. Believe it or not, despite the fact that I'd always been a Eurosceptic, I did not take this decision lightly, or without some forethought. I genuinely tried to weigh up both sides of the argument, but in the end, it seemed to me inevitable that if Remain were to win this referendum, then all further resistance to the European integration would effectively be steamrolled very rapidly, and the United Kingdom would effectively become co-opted as a wholeheartedly part of the project, which would lead inevitably to us becoming part of the federal European state. Again, terrified of this when we've said before, if you didn't want to do this, we had a veto rule where we could, if European wanted to federalize, we could have very vetoed it. And bear in mind, this idea of a European federal state existing, not beyond the realms of possibility, but can anyone point to me, anyone anywhere in the European Parliament where this type of bill is currently going on? Again, oh dear. So there was no way on earth that I could campaign for that. And so, after first weighing it up, I resolved very clearly in my own mind that it would declare for leave campaign accordingly. If I'm honest though, I thought we were going to lose. It seemed to me that the odds were stacked so heavily against us, the government booklet notwithstanding, and such was the power of the broadcast media, almost whom were almost privately in favour of Remain, that there was very little that we could do to win. Nevertheless, I felt that this had turned into something of a 21st century charge of the Light Brigade. It would be important to go down fighting because this was a great principle at stake. In effect, it was going to be a battle for the destiny of our country, and if we had to fight wholeheartedly, even if the odds were heavily against us, after all, our forebears had fought in battles in the past and still triumphed against all the odds, so perhaps this was very little chance that we might somehow do the same. I remember being at home on Sunday evening, and the phone rang, and some on the other end of the line was again Chief Whip, Mark Harper, someone who I had always admired and got on well with, who politely inquired if I decided how I was going to campaign in the referendum. I told Chief then that having thought it over, I was going to vote and campaign for leave, and I was very unlikely to change my mind. The Chief Whip took it well and told me without rancour that the Prime Minister would obviously be very disappointed, but he was never rude or angry at any point. If you know Mark Harper, it's just not his style. When I reminded him, of course, that the Prime Minister had said that ministers with long-standing convictions could support the Leave campaign, and that I had indeed made my maiden speech 15 years ago against the growing power of the European institutions, that I did also count that as evidence of my long-standing conviction. The Chief quietly took the point and wished me very well in the campaign, but not too well, and we parted on good terms. Shortly after this private conversation, I then publicly announced that I was supporting the Leave campaign. So here we are, Mark Francois is now part of the Leave campaign. In the end, there were just over a dozen or so, roughly, ministers in government who came out for Leave. In the first rank, of course, there were very prominent members of the cabinet. including Michael Gove, Chris Grayling, Penny Mordaunt, Priti Patel, Theresa Villas, John Whittingdale, and Cameron, had apparently been courting both Grove and Boris for the campaign for Remain, and was reportedly very disappointed on both counts. I remember the media scrum outside Boris's house in London when they waited for him to come out onto the London pavement to finally declare his decision. In the event, he told this waiting press scrum, I will be advocating for vote leave, or whatever the term is called. I understand there is a lot of them, because I want a better deal for the people of this country and to save them money and to try and take back control. That is really what this is all about. Some people, of course, have criticised Boris Johnson for his hesitation and for even the fact that, given his strong journalistic background, he repeatedly, repudiatedly, wrote up 2 op-ed pieces, one arguing the case for leave and one arguing for Remain. Critics have seen this side a site of indecision. However, Winston Churchill, when faced with a dilemma, would also apparently sometimes take a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle and try and mark it in one column as a plus and one side as a minus, and then list the advantages and disadvantages and give the course of action as a method to try and help decide what to do. And as a journalist, I think Boris Johnson was trying to do the same. No, he wasn't. Boris was weighing up both sides. Again, Mark Francois trying to compare Boris Johnson to Winston Churchill. Very strange there, nevertheless. So, I was very much, of course, in the second tier of junior ministers who came out to campaign for leave, including, of course, Steve Sparker, James Dulridge, and myself, although none of us enjoyed anything like the prominence of Michael Gove or Boris Johnson. It did a bit demoralise us that this was just not an issue with the cabinet ministers felt strongly, but either also filtered down to the lower ministerial ranks as well. Even though I were heavily outnumbered by ministers who campaigned for Remain, I can report in all honesty that I never remember any of the government being rude to me, at least at the time, about my decision. I think it was strange that most people had already worked out where I stood on the European issue, and that me and my ministerial career would probably be destroyed afterwards once Remain had inevitably triumphed, and so basically left me to get on with it. As someone who had come into Parliament already very wary about the growing power of the European institutions, I had helped to lead us out of the EEP, and it was the Lisbon Treaty that had convinced me that one day we would have to leave the European Union. Although, when the treaty was ratified in 2008, it never occurred to me for a single moment that any such opportunity would present itself with just another 8 years. Finally, the referendum campaign. A great deal has already been written about the EU referendum campaign of 2016. One of them, the best summarises on the undoubtedly by the telling of Tim Shipman's tour de force all-out war, William Collins, 2016. Channel 4 subsequently produced a drama entitled The Uncivil War, which highlighted Dominic Cummings, brilliantly portrayed by Benedict Cumberbatch, as the driving force behind the official Vote Leave campaign, persuade us to leave the European Union. This may well be true, not at least as Cummings did have a reputation as a formidable campaigner. However, I believe that the eventual result was an incredible team effort between experienced politicians, pollsters, and skilled campaigners at the national level, combined with some extremely hard grassroots campaigning as people from a variety of political backgrounds, or indeed in many cases absolutely none at all, took up not arms but leaflets, posters, and actively went out into the high streets, onto the doorsteps, up and down the United Kingdom, with quite passionately to make the case for leaving the European Union. So, from my own point of view, I had very little interaction with the national campaign. It was only in and out for Vote Leave, headquarters 3 Albert Embankment, just across from the river from Parliament. And on a handful of occasions, I spent most of my time of the referendum campaign around Essex, in particular my own local constituency of Raleigh and Wiswick, along with the coalition of local Conservatives plus UKIP, including John Halter, my opponent at the 2015 general election. Several other UKIP councillors and a handful of independents and some other grassroots Eurosceptic organisations such as Leave.eu. Interesting. In addition to the official literature and posters produced by the Vote Leave campaign, I decided as a local MP I should nail my colours to the Yeah, it does actually say that. And therefore paid for a two-side A4 leaflet headed "Why I'm Backing Brexit" by Mark Francois, which was then printed and distributed across my constituency by members of our impromptu cross-party coalition. The opening paragraph went as follows. Dear constituents, you may remember receiving an expensive taxpayer-funded government leaflet recently about the forthcoming EU referendum on Thursday the 23rd of June. It is, of course, your democratic right to vote whichever way you choose, but I have funded this leaflet to try and give you the other side of the story, to try and explain to my constituents why I'm voting to leave the EU. I believe that there are three key reasons for doing this. I don't know if he's going to give those reasons, but we'll see. I then summarised them as taking back control of our country, seeking value for money, and reasserting control over our borders. None of those have gone very well. Again, aged like milk, the promises of the Brexiteers indeed have. And of course, at the bottom of the page, I added the following passage. In summary, I want to live in a democracy where we take back control of our borders, elect our own government, and make our own laws, which again, we very much clearly did. Mark, you were an MP. You took part in these elections. In Britain, we had once a lifetime opportunity to try and secure this in June. I very much hope that we will take it. I further amplified this case back on the back of the leaflet with a photograph of me shaking hands with Boris in the New Palace Yard in London of the new House of Commons with Big Ben, before surrounding it with scaffolding in the background. At the end, it added, obeytedly, my excellent chairman and consular agency, Hilton, added, many local volunteers. We managed to get over 30,000 of these leaflets printed and delivered throughout virtually every door of the constituency prior to polling day. We also went out and manned stores in the high street in order to give out literature and try and persuade people to vote leave. I threw myself into the campaign with gusto, although I still privately thought that we were very much were odds against us winning. Here's a good chapter, Project Fear. So, my first real inkling that we might actually win this was when I heard my former boss, the Chancellor George Osborne, on the Today programme, effectively threatening the British people with a punishment budget if we were to vote to leave the EU. He further predicted that in such a scenario, three things would rapidly follow. Firstly, let's see how many of these have been proven right. Firstly, the economy would dive into a recession. Now, technically, we are in a recession, but that's more due to COVID. But hey, without COVID, there is evidence that we could very well be in a recession. We are currently facing what is called stagflation. Again, it could very easily lead to a recession. Secondly, unemployment would soar to over 500,000, and in the short order. And thirdly, the house prices would collapse by 18%. How the Treasury calculated this and why they made it 18%, not 19, 20, or 25, I don't know, but nevertheless, 18% it was. I remember sipping my morning coffee and putting my tie on as George made the broadcast and me thinking this. My goodness, George, you've just made the most fundamental mistake. Both George and I had read history at university, and one thing runs as golden thread throughout British history is that you cannot bully us. Many people have tried and failed. Oh dear, he's trying to invoke the bulldog spirit. The British are an inherently reasonable people, often far more patient than many go their counterparts. But this is far beyond the point to which they simply will not go. And what sounded like a blatant attempt to bully or even frighten the British people to vote to remain in the EU seemed to me to be a fundamental error on the behalf of the Remain campaign, so this pretty much proved to be. In fact, thankfully, the whole Remain campaign was something of a disaster. I sort of agree with him on that. It was very much hampered by the squabbles about who was really in charge, and the fact that the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, an instinctive Eurosceptic for most of his political life, constantly failed to rally Labour voters to the Remain banner. Reportedly, he agreed time and time again to undertake the national media performances in support of Remain, only to pull out at short notice to point clearly highlighted in a subsequent Channel 4 documentary. In addition, the Remain campaign produced very few positive reasons at all for remaining in the European Union. The crux of their campaign was aimed at the alleged economic consequences for the ordinary family of leaving the EU, which most of those are going to turn out to be true. We are seeing those already, filled with the portents of doom about economic disaster, rising unemployment. If the British people were to display the tenacity to try and govern themselves, we already do, Mark. Back in 2016, we did. But there you go. This barrage, of course, doom-laden scaremongering, was willingly amplified by the ardent Remainers across the broadcast media repeatedly and became characterised as Project Fear, which almost certainly worked in the government's disadvantage, as many voters who perhaps might not have been stirred by more traditional arguments over sovereignty simply reacted out of adversity against the shameful attempt to try and bully men by their own government. The introduction, of course, of President Obama to Remain campaign was obviously a further example of this trait. Again, how true were Obama's words about being at the back of the interview? Interesting. Whilst many of them almost hero worshipped Obama as an incredibly articulate and empathetic Democratic president, they seemingly failed to calculate the adverse reaction that would follow the American president intervening in a British referendum, when he famously implied that if Britain did indeed vote to leave the EU, would effectively go to the back of the queue, seeming to have to negotiate a trade deal with the United States. We are at the back of the queue. He was right. You were wrong there. Just thought this. Many thought the campaign point would be decisive. However, sitting in a pub in a depressed northern town, this intervention was less than entirely persuasive. Again and again, the Remain campaign played at the attempt to play on people's fears, whereas the Vote Leave campaign appealed more to hope. As Dominic Cumming character says in the Channel 4 documentary, we've got to appeal to their heads, whereas we've got to appeal to their hearts. So the next part is, hang on, we could win this. It was really within a week to go that I finally began to believe that we had a chance of winning. Almost everyone that I spoke to in my constituency told me that we're going to vote to leave. To begin with, I put this something down as an Essex microclimate, as the country has historically always been, as the county has always been historically one of the most Eurosceptic in the UK. Nevertheless, I started ringing other pro-leave MPs in other parts of the country, including the North, the Midlands, and the West Country. Many of them reportedly exactly the same phenomenon. They were also having trouble finding anybody who would publicly admit to voting Remain. Interesting. I think that's going to change very quickly. Also, yeah, that quote, you are right, Alex, about that. That you're going to appeal to their hearts. That is exactly how manipulation works. So, thanks for admitting that you manipulated the public there, Mark. I'm sure that's going to work out great for you in the future. When all those promises have come home to roost. All the pundits have said that London would vote overwhelmingly to Remain, as indeed had previously been the case, but I was finally beginning to believe that the weight of opinion outside the M25 had begun to shift decisively towards voting Leave, and that perhaps on the night we just might somehow snatch it. I remember subsequently going to the local count at Clements Hall in Hawkwell on the evening of June 23rd, hoping against hope that we might somehow have done it, and being when the first result came in from Newcastle around midnight, the result showed a narrow victory for Remain, but narrower than many of the commentators had been predicting. A friend from the Vote Leave HQ then texted me, said, Sunderland will be the win in a few minutes, and that should really tell us how it's going to go on. If we win in Sunderland, we're going to do this thing. I mentioned this to the other people in the hall, including UKIP activists, whom we've been working for weeks, and this led to great excitement. I remember one of them saying, Mark's got the inside track. He says that if we win Sunderland, we've done it. Anyway, a few minutes later, the Sunderland result came in, and it came through. It did indeed show a clear majority to Leave. And in some way, this was very analogous to the Tory victory in Basildon back in 1992, when those in the know realised that it must have meant that the Conservatives had indeed won the general election. Similarly, once Sunderland result had came in, those in the know on both sides suddenly realised, incredibly, that Vote Leave had won. This, of course, was particularly embarrassing for Andrew Cooper. Now, Lord Cooper, David Cameron's private pollster, who would apparently, rather aggrievedly, texted the Vote Leave headquarters immediately after the close of the poll to tell them, with some fanfare, that Remain had won by a clear margin of at least 10 points. The reply from Vote Leave was a long list of let's just wait and see, and it wasn't long before those in Downing Street realised that Cooper was horribly mistaken and the game was up. I remember leaving the count in the small hours, travelling back home to put on the television, in order to witness a series of the flood of results in. Only confirmed this trend. Famously around 5 o'clock in the morning, David Dimbleby, the anchorman for the BBC results programme, declared, "That's it, we're out." At this point, also elated but exhausted, I decided to go to bed, unaware the Prime Minister was about to announce his resignation only several hours later. Whilst I was asleep, for the record, the result of the EU26 referendum was as follows. So, noted. But yep, we know the results. It was incredibly close. Let's not put it down. There was only 2% in this. This is not as a clear victory as the Brexiteers like to make out. It was incredibly close. It was within the margin of error, 2%. And of course, as other votes had previously read out, that if this was held literally a week later, Remain would have won. And now we are seeing a massive swing from people in this country saying that we indeed did make the wrong decision. And of course, will the Brexiteers allow the country to have another democratic say that we want, shall we say, back into the European Union? I think that they are going to very, very quickly deny the will of the people when it comes to, shall we say, wanting maybe that referendum. So, against all the odds, against all the evidence of the four main political parties in the United Kingdom, and against the wishes of the overwhelming majority of what might be called the British establishment, including vast numbers of journalists, the electoral media, and despite the determined efforts of Project Fear, the British people actually voted for democratic self-government and their right to decide their own destiny after all. So, that's his view, really, of the referendum. It's, of course, very, very light. Like I say, there's far more to be said, honestly, about the referendum, about how it happened. But again, we'll see how this plays out. Like I say, we're almost in this chapter now, so we'll read the last. So, nevertheless, with obviously Cameron having abruptly resigned, as the old saying goes, politics abhors a vacuum. And so a large number of leadership candidates rapidly got underway to try and secure his replacement. Some much faster than others, and unlike previous years, I did not really become actively involved in any of these campaigns. I just wanted the content, the content that we'd actually. I was actually content that we'd actually won the referendum, and now we were going to leave the EU. However, I admit that I did vote for Theresa May in the first ballot for Conservative MPs, whereas ideologically, as it were, I might have been expected to vote for Angela Leadsom. But I had some reservations about her relative lack of experience. In the end, Leadsom's campaign effectively imploded after a disastrous interview with the Times newspaper, in which she highlighted the fact that Theresa May did not have children, whereas she did. I believe that this was a genuine mistake and was not meant to try and malign in any manner, but nevertheless, the press reaction to her remarks was so vitriolic that she was effectively forced to withdraw from the contest, leaving Theresa May as the only candidate standing and thus obtaining both the needed number of votes, and extended the campaign for the election to be finally concede the Conservative members around the country. Again, Mark doesn't seem to mention there were a lot of candidates who dropped out rapidly during this campaign, and then it came down to Leadsom and May. And even that happened very fast. And Leadsom was seen as the Brexiteer candidate. This is the candidate you wanted if you were a Brexiteer. And obviously, Theresa May was seen as the concession candidate. This will, again, attempt to heal the Conservative Party between those Leave and Remain factions. Didn't happen. Her election for that did not happen. So there was, of course, no runoff and no final postal ballot. Her Majesty the Queen did call Theresa May to Buckingham Palace on 3rd July 2016, when she subsequently merged with Number 10 and promised a new government based on making Britain a country that works for everyone. Famously in an interview shortly after, she declared that Brexit means Brexit, although she was very vague on the detail because, again, that was Brexit in a nutshell, and how precisely this was to be achieved. And in many ways, this was the harbinger of what to follow, although most of us did not realise it at the time. So, that's Chapter 8. Chapter 9 is the ERG in the Road to Chequers. But I think we'll leave that, for another time. Because I'll tell you what, one chapter's enough for me. One chapter's more than enough. One chapter's more than enough for me. Anything new from the Nostradamus? He repeats the same thing. He repeats literally the same thing of what we've heard before from many of the Brexiteers. And again, look where we are now. It has been said multiple times that when we were obviously at 2019, and we saw obviously the coming pandemic, a lot of people did say, look, we can't do both the pandemic and the Brexit at the same time. We need to be able to concentrate. And it has come out very recently that ministers who could have been, well, not ministers, but civil servants who could have been working on the pandemic, helping out with stuff on that, basically were hog-tied up trying to sort out Brexit rather than focusing on the pandemic. It's pretty bird. You wonder if Francois is going to do the audiobook himself. No, they'd pay someone to do that, probably. Like I say, Christ, this is a weighty tome. This is you could kill someone with this book. Like I say, it's 464 pages, but it's very, 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 very weighty. So, yeah, and he's got a big appendix as well of all the stuff. He's very, actually, surprisingly, I must say, I'm very surprised. If there's one thing I have to give Mark Francois credit for, is that he has a massive, like, this is like the end of the book. It's all sort of acknowledgements and the citing the research, which good for him, to be honest, for actually doing that. I'm actually surprised he has. So, oh yeah, he's also got a tribute to the late Sir David Amess, but I'm not going to bother falling through that. So many emails and things from his iPhones. And for some reason, he's got a Rudyard Kipling quote in here. Again, that makes a lot of reference to the Empire. But as I said before, that's typical Brexiteer nonsense guff, really, at the end of the day. Yeah. Spartan victory, ladies and gentlemen. Our first foray into the colouring book that is Mark Francois' book. Oh, thank you very much, Carol G. Thanks, I think, for a whiskey. I'll definitely need one. But yes, next time we shall delve into the next part, which was, again, heavily to do with the ERG and, of course, taking us up to Chequers, which I'm sure will be very interesting for reading. But of course, next week we'll have to see what happens. Obviously, there is going to be by-election tomorrow, which could be quite interesting. We'll see. But needless to say, thank you very much all for joining me this evening. It's been very fruitful and I'd say enjoyable, but Mark Francois' awful book. And like I say, some of the spelling errors. Bear in mind, I have dyslexia, and it takes a lot for me to recognize when someone, should we say, is the deliberate spelling error in a book. So it takes a lot for me to even when I get tripped up by spelling error in there, that is me literally going, that's spelt wrong. And for me who's getting dyslexic, picking up the fact that is spelt wrong, yeah. it's very obviously desperately in need of an editor. But as always, like I say, thank you very much one and all for joining me this evening. Like I say, we will be going back visiting Mark Francois' book later, of course. We'll probably pick up another chapter next week about the ERG and see what else Mark has to say about that. Of course, it might depend, of course, what happens tomorrow. Next week could be quite an interesting week for Boris Johnson. It might not be shall we say, a very quiet Christmas for the man. But before you do all leave, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And thank you very much to all those who do support the channel that way. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page. And of course, my one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, buy me coffee. And also the YouTube memberships are open as well if you would like to help support the channel that way as well. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. I will see you on Saturday for the Good Morning Walk, where we will no doubt talk about the fallout from tomorrow's by-election that's going down in North Shropshire. If it is, if the Lib Dems do end up winning, it will be a seismic victory for the Lib Dems. It will be massive. We're talking they've pulled off the Everest of election victories. So good luck to the Lib Dems out there campaigning for that. If you do win, good job. If the Conservatives do manage to hold on just by a finger, still good job. But you definitely, shall we say, will be a very good kick in the pants for the Conservative Party, even if that happens. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for joining this evening. And like I say, we'll see you all on Saturday, of course, for the Good Morning Walk. And of course, we've got more videos coming out as well this week. And of course, we'll see you probably next Wednesday for another chapter in Spartan Victory.